Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to pull out the key insights from really fascinating sources, giving you that shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
That's the goal.
So today, let's step back. Imagine it's New Year's Day, 1862, Washington, D.C. You've got the Marine Band playing, carriages in the streets, President Lincoln greeting literally thousands at the White House. The New York Times apparently called it unusually beautiful.
Paints a nice picture, doesn't it? Festive, almost normal.
Almost. But beneath all that, well, a storm was brewing. Big time. Not just for the country, but personally for Lincoln, too.
Absolutely. 1862, it really was a crucible year for him. It tested everything, his leadership, his political skills, and, well, it ultimately broke his heart.
Yeah. So our deep dive today uses Doris Kearns Goodwin's amazing book, Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln. We're going to unpack how Lincoln handled just relentless political battles, military setbacks, and then this truly unimaginable personal loss.
Right. And our mission here is really to get at the essence of his political genius, but also his moral strength, forged under this immense pressure.
And the stakes were incredibly high. You need to understand this period because the country was, 9 months into the Civil War?
Deep into it. And public patience was wearing really thin. You had stories everywhere about corruption, mismanagement in the War Department, just no real progress on the battlefield.
And the money.
The Treasury was struggling badly to raise funds. You had critics like this diarist Count Growski warning that, the worst is to be expected if the mistakes of 61 just kept rolling.
And Lincoln knew it. He knew the buck stopped with him. He even said he feared the bottom was out of the tub.
Wow.
So this isn't just history. It's really a lesson in resilience and strategy and empathy under extreme fire. Let's dig into how this pivotal year really started.
Okay, so one of the first big problems Lincoln had to tackle was the War Department. It was run by Secretary Simon Cameron, and frankly, it was a disaster.
A disaster how? Like specifically?
Widespread criticism, reports of just lax management, really shady contracts, weapons that didn't work, horses arriving diseased, even rotten food for the soldiers. It was bad, a real crisis of confidence.
That sounds awful. I read even William Seward, his Secretary of State, was worried Lincoln wasn't paying enough attention.
Initially, yeah. But that was Lincoln's style sometimes, right? Quietly observing, thinking things through. Seward actually tells a story about Lincoln showing up late one night in January.
Oh, yeah.
And Lincoln just starts talking about the War Department, basically saying he knew as much about it as any of us. And then he drops the bombshell. His mind was settled on replacing Cameron.
Wow. So he wasn't ignoring it. He was strategizing, that deliberate, calculated approach.
Exactly. Even when he seemed sort of slow to act.
So who was he thinking of? Who were the obvious choices to replace Cameron?
Well, you had people like Joseph Holt, who had been war secretary under Buchanan and was seen as loyal to the Union. Or maybe Montgomery Blair, a West Point guy, known for being sharp in cabinet meetings.
Okay, logical choices. But Lincoln, he went somewhere else entirely, didn't he?
Completely different direction. He picked Edwin Stanton.
Stanton! Wait, wasn't he the lawyer who, publicly humiliated Lincoln in a court case years before? And wasn't he super critical of Lincoln's presidency?
The very same guy.
Yeah.
Gruff, outspoken, had openly disparaged Lincoln. It seems like an absolutely astonishing choice for a wartime cabinet post.
So what was the thinking there? Was it just politics, or did Lincoln see something specific in Stanton?
It was a really fascinating mix. Inside Washington, many people thought it was actually Seward and Chase, his big rivals in the cabinet, who pushed for Stanton.
Really? They agreed on something?
Rarely. But Seward liked Stanton because Stanton had secretly fed him information during the end of Buchanan's term, helping spot potential traitors. Chase, on the other hand, was genuinely close friends with Stanton and saw him as an ally against slavery. So politically, appointing Stanton kind of placated both of them.
Okay, that makes some political sense. But Lincoln must have had his own reasons too, right? Beyond just managing Seward and Chase.
Oh, absolutely. Lincoln had seen Stanton operate up close during that Reaper trial years back. And he was apparently blown away by Stanton's powerful arguments, his passion, his incredible energy. Someone said Stanton puts his whole soul into any cause he espouses.
So Lincoln saw that drive, that intensity, was exactly what the War Department needed. Talent over personal feelings.
Precisely. He needed that kind of bulldozer to fix the mess Cameron left.
Speaking of Cameron, how did Lincoln handle getting rid of him? That couldn't have been easy.
No, and Lincoln initially fumbled it a bit, actually. He sent Cameron this really blunt, almost brusque letter of dismissal.
Ouch. How did Cameron take that?
He was devastated, called it a personal degradation, but then Lincoln's political genius kicked in.
Okay, how so?
That same night, Cameron talked to Chase, they got Seward involved, and this trio basically went back to Lincoln to smooth things over.
And Lincoln listened.
He did. Showed amazing flexibility. He agreed to withdraw the harsh letter and replaced it with a warm one. It framed the departure as Cameron's idea, offered him a nice post as minister to Russia, and even said Cameron would leave with Lincoln's undiminished confidence.
Wow, that's quite a turnaround.
Pure strategy. Then Lincoln asked Cameron to recommend a successor, already knowing he wanted Stanton.
Never.
So in the end, Seward, Chase, and Cameron all thought they were the key players in getting Stanton appointed. Lincoln let each rival feel influential. Great coalition building.
That's incredible maneuvering. So Stanton comes in. What was the immediate impact? Was it as dramatic as Lincoln hoped?
Absolutely revolutionary. Stanton was 47, looked older apparently, but his energy was just off the charts. He took a massive pay cut to do the job from like $50,000 a year as a lawyer down to $8,000.
Wow. Dedication.
Yeah, his one condition was bringing in his trusted friend Peter Watson to handle contracts. Smart move.
So what did he actually do differently?
Total regime change. Discipline.
Mm.
Efficiency. Cameron's office was constantly swamped with people looking for jobs, delaying actual war business. Stanton immediately set strict rules. Written communications handled first thing. Specific days for congressmen, specific days for the public. He cut through all that bureaucratic noise.
And he wasn't afraid to say no, even to powerful people.
And not at all. There's a great story about Mary Lincoln sending him a note asking for a job for some unqualified guy.
Uh-oh.
Stanton just ripped up the note, sent the guy away. Later, he politely explained to Mrs. Lincoln that his first duty was to the country and protecting her husband's honor.
How did she react?
Amazingly, she totally understood. Told him he was right and promised never to ask again. And apparently she kept her word.
That says a lot about Stanton's immediate authority.
It really does. The change was visible across Washington. People said the very atmosphere of the city breathes of change. Stanton was all business. Brief meetings, clear communication, intense focus.
So this whole transition, it really shows Lincoln's strengths, doesn't it? Putting the country first, managing egos, even being generous to the guy he fired.
Exactly. That undiminished confidence line for Cameron. It cemented Cameron's loyalty long term. Just brilliant leadership.
Okay, so the War Department is getting sorted under Stanton. Things may be looking up a bit. But for the Lincolns personally, things took a different turn, right? Even as Mary was planning this big White House ball.
Yeah, the timing is just heartbreaking in retrospect.
Yeah.
Mary wanted to create a sense of normalcy, maybe even prestige. So she planned this very exclusive, elegant ball for 500 guests on February 5th. A big deal.
She really threw herself into it.
Meticulously. The Marine Band, a famous New York caterer, she had this beautiful white satin dress. Lincoln apparently teased her about it. It was meant to be this grand affair, projecting confidence.
But behind the scenes, illness was stalking Washington.
It really was. That January saw a lot of sickness, smallpox, typhoid fever. It hit several prominent families, the Stantons, the Sewards, the Chases. And then it hit the White House.
Willie Lincoln.
Willie first, yeah. He came down with a fever just days before the ball. Then his younger brother, Tad, got sick too. It was almost certainly typhoid, probably from the White House water, which came straight from the Potomac River. Pretty unsanitary back then.
Oh, no. So Mary must have wanted to cancel the ball?
She did, understandably. But the invitations were out, and Lincoln hesitated. They called in a well-regarded doctor who examined Willie and said, he seemed stable, in no immediate danger.
So they decided to go ahead.
They did. A tough call. So the ball happens, the White House is lit up, carriages arriving, all the Washington bigwigs are there. McClellan, the new Secretary Stanton.
Quite the scene.
Society pages raved about it. Exquisite taste, they said. But Mary, she was just consumed with worry. Her seamstress, Elizabeth Keckley, remembered her constantly slipping away from the party, going upstairs to check on Willie.
Oh, I can just picture that. A mother's private agony amidst all that public show. It's haunting.
It truly is. And while this sort of forced gaiety was happening at the White House, things are finally starting to move on the military front, especially with a name Lincoln would soon rely on heavily, Ulysses S. Grant.
Grant. Right. He wasn't exactly a star before the war, was he?
Not at all.
Yeah.
West Point grad, yeah, but he'd resigned from the Army, struggled with alcohol, ended up working as a leather salesman. The war was really his second chance, and he seized it.
With those victories in the West, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson.
Exactly. The Union's first really significant wins. It was a joint Army-Navy operation with Admiral Foote. Grant sends this classic terse telegram. Fort Henry is ours. I shall take and destroy Fort Donelson on the 8th. Just pure determination.
And then came Fort Donelson and that famous phrase.
Unconditional surrender, yeah. The Confederate commander, Buckner, asked for terms, and Grant just fires back. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted.
And the North just went wild, right?
Absolutely. 100-gun salutes, celebrations. Lincoln immediately promoted Grant to Major General. People saw this stark difference between Grant's Western hardihood, his willingness to fight, and maybe the perceived Eastern luxury or caution of generals like McClellan. Lincoln definitely thought.
A huge moment. Strategically vital, giving the Union a foothold in the South and bringing Grant onto the main stage. Lincoln recognizing that effectiveness, but while the country is celebrating.
Yeah, that celebration, that jubilation,
Yeah.
it just didn't reach the White House. While the nation cheered Grant, Willie Lincoln's condition had gotten much, much worse.
And Tad was sick, too.
Tad was also critically ill, both boys battling typhoid. Willie's symptoms were just awful high fever, terrible pain, internal bleeding, delirium, just complete exhaustion.
It must have been agony for Lincoln and Mary.
Unimaginable. Mary apparently almost wore herself out with watching over them day and night. She canceled everything. Lincoln, despite the war pressing down, spent as much time as he possibly could with his sons. There's a story of Willie's young friend, Bud Taft, staying by his bedside until he fell asleep, and Lincoln himself gently carried the friend off to bed.
Just devastating.
As the news got out, Washington sort of fell silent.
Yeah.
Planned celebrations for the Donelson victory were quietly canceled. A real hush fell over the White House. And then on Thursday, February 20th, late afternoon, Willie died.
Oh, God.
Lincoln just broke down. Burst into his secretary Nicolay's office, sobbing, "Well, Nicolay, my boy is gone. He's actually gone."
Yeah.
Elizabeth Keckley said even Lincoln's, strong, rugged nature was just convulsed with emotion. Such a humanizing, heartbreaking moment.
I can't even imagine leading a country at war and facing that. How did Mary cope?
Mary was, as Keckley put it, simply inconsolable. She had conversions. She kept saying Willie was supposed to be the hope and stay of her old age. She just withdrew completely, couldn't sleep, couldn't even really bear to be around Tad for a while or see his friends. The grief just overwhelmed her.
So Lincoln had to manage his own grief and try to care for Tad, who was still very sick.
Yes. With Mary unable to cope, Lincoln turned elsewhere for help. He brought in Dorothea Dix, the superintendent of women nurses. She recommended a nurse named Rebecca Pomeroy.
Was there something special about her?
Poignantly, yes. She was a young widow who had lost 2 children herself and had experience with typhoid patients. When Lincoln heard her story, he apparently broke down weeping, telling her, "This is the hardest trial of my life. Why is it? Oh, why is it?"
That connection, that shared grief.
It's incredibly moving. He'd often bring his work into Tad's sick room, but the minute Tad stirred, Lincoln would drop everything, be right there at his side, sometimes still in his dressing gown, just to father.
And the funeral?
It was held quickly the next day in the East Room. Mary was too grief-stricken to attend. She couldn't bear it. Lincoln made sure Bud Taft, Willie's friend, got to see him one last time. As people arrived, this terrible storm blew up heavy rain, high winds.
Like the heavens were weeping too.
Almost. Willie was temporarily placed in a vault at Oak Hill Cemetery. And Lincoln, who always seemed haunted by the memory of bad weather hitting Anne Rutledge's grave years before, apparently took some small comfort that Willie's body was at least sheltered from the storm.
Such different ways of coping between Lincoln and Mary weren't there.
Profoundly different and very revealing. Mary spiraled into guilt. She convinced herself Willie's death was punishment for her ambition, her pride for being so wrapped up in the world.
And that led her towards spiritualism.
Yes, through Elizabeth Keckley. She started attending seances, hoping to see Willie again. It gave her some temporary relief. And that was becoming quite common during the Civil War, with so many families losing loved ones. It offered a kind of comfort.
But Lincoln's path was different.
Very different. Outwardly, he threw himself back into work. It was maybe a way to cope, to function. But privately, the loss was just excruciating. He started this ritual. Every Thursday, he'd go into the green room alone, just to grieve.
He needed that private space.
He did. He told someone, "That blow overwhelmed me. It showed me my weaknesses I had never felt before." He didn't seek out mediums. He found comfort in dreams, dreaming of Willie. He described it as having this sweet communion, but always knowing it was not a reality.
That sounds incredibly poignant.
He kept Willie's things close, a painting, a scrapbook. He believed the dead lived on in the minds of the living, So keeping that memory vivid was essential for him.
And this personal tragedy, it must have changed him as a leader, right? It wasn't just a private sorrow.
Absolutely. More than anything else, perhaps, Willie's death allowed Lincoln to really connect on a deep personal level with the grief that was sweeping the nation. Losing soldiers, sons, brothers. He understood that pain now in his bones.
It deepened his empathy.
Profoundly. It forged a different kind of leader, one who truly felt the human cost of the war he was directing. He wasn't just the commander-in-chief anymore, he was a fellow mourner.
It's such a powerful, if terribly sad, connection.
It really is,
Mhm.
and it undoubtedly shaped his perspective and his decisions moving forward.
So, looking back at this intense period, early 1862, Lincoln really was navigating a perfect storm.
No
He
question.
pulled off this masterful cabinet reshuffle with Stanton, showing incredible political skill, managing rivals, strengthening his government.
Right, getting the right tough person in place.
He recognized military effectiveness in Grant, securing those crucial early victories in the West when morale was low.
Huge wins. Turned the tide, psychologically at least.
But at the exact same time, he faced this devastating personal blow with Willie's death, forcing him to lead through profound grief. It just highlights this incredible intertwining of personal resilience and political strategy.
Yeah, this deep dive really shows how those external crises and the most internal personal struggles can just converge and profoundly shape a leader, revealing their humanity right when the nation needs it most.
Exactly. So the takeaway for you, listening, think about this. How might experiencing such a profound personal loss uniquely equip a leader, especially one governing a nation drowning in its own grief?
Mm-hmm.
How does that kind of deep empathy, forged in personal tragedy, actually influence the decisions of a wartime president? And maybe how does it shape how we think about leadership even today?
That's a really powerful question to ponder. That weight of shared grief carried by someone who truly understands it personally.
Yeah.
It absolutely changed Lincoln.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into what was truly a transformative time in American history and in Lincoln's life.
Hope you found it insightful.
We hope you've gained some new perspectives on the complexities of leadership, strategy, and just the human spirit under pressure.